Good evening, and welcome to the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus in Hong Kong for the second episode of our new fall Ewan Lecture program, the U.S. Presidential Election. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus in Hong Kong. Tonight we have a great lineup of speakers and a lot to get into in discussion of the resiliency of the U.S. democracy and election system and potential consequences during COVID-19. And I want to remind you, our audience, our next episode of the series, The Clash of Great Powers, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Primacy, will be held October 15th at 8:30 p.m. Hong Kong time. Our guest speaker then will be University of Chicago Professor John Mearsheimer. Tonight you can submit your questions through the questions and answer button by registering on Zoom. And I want to mention to all Americans tuning in from around the world, you still have time to register and vote. Now let me introduce our special guests. Nick Stephanopoulos is Professor of Law at Harvard Law School at Harvard University. He'll moderate the panel this evening. Nick's research and teaching interests include election law, constitutional law, administrative law, legislation, and comparative law. He was previously the Professor of Law and the Herbert and Marjorie Fried Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. Nick is a graduate of Yale Law, where he was editor-in-chief of the Yale Journal of International Law. He received his MPhil in European Studies from Cambridge and an AB in Government from Harvard. He's the co-founder of PlanScore, a website evaluating past, present, and proposed district plans. Nick is also a member of policy reform initiatives, including the Campaign Legal Center's Litigation Strategy Council and the Committee for the Study of Digital Platforms. Nick has been named to the Political 50 list and the National Law Journal's Chicago 40 Under 40. He's been involved in several litigation efforts, including a pair of partisan gerrymandering lawsuits based on his academic work that recently reached the Supreme Court. He's a frequent commentator, and his writings have appeared in major publications like the New York Times and academic journals like the University of Chicago Law Review. Richard Pildes is professor of New York University and is one of the United States' leading scholars of constitutional law and a specialist in legal issues concerning democracy. A former law clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall, Rick has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute, and has also received recognition as a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Scholar. In his acclaimed casebook, The Law of Democracy, Rick helped create an entirely new field of study in law schools. His work systematically explores legal and policy issues concerning the structure of democratic elections and institutions, such as the role of money in politics, the design of election districts, the regulation of political parties, the structure of voting systems, and the representation of minority interest in democratic institutions. He's written on the rise of political polarization in the United States, the transformation of the presidential nominations process, the Voting Rights Act, including editing a book titled The Future of the Voting Rights Act, the dysfunction of America's political processes, the role of the Supreme Court in overseeing American democracy, and the powers of the American president and Congress. Rick has also written on national security law, the design of the regulatory state, and American constitutional history and theory. Rick has successfully argued voting rights and election law cases before the United States Supreme Court and the Courts of Appeals, and is a well-known public commentator. He writes frequently for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and was part of the Emmy-nominated NBC Breaking News team for coverage of the 2000 Bush versus Gore contest. Gowri Ramachandran comes to the Brennan Center for Justice from Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, California, where she's on leave as a professor of law. At Southwestern, she taught courses in constitutional law, employment discrimination, critical race theory, and the Ninth Circuit Appellate Litigation Clinic, which received the Ninth Circuit's 2018 Distinguished Pro Bono Service Award. She serves on the Ninth Circuit's Fairness Committee, which considers racial, religious, gender, and other disparities in the administration of justice. She received her undergraduate degree in mathematics from Yale University and a master's degree in statistics from Harvard University. While in law school, she served as the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. After graduating from law school in 2003, Gowri served as a law clerk to Judge Sidney R. Thomas of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in Billings, Montana. She joined the Southwestern Law faculty in 2006 after a fellowship at Georgetown University Law Center. Enrijeta Shino is an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Florida. Enrijeta earned her PhD in political science from the University of Florida in 2019. Her research interests span the topics of elections, turnout, voter behavior, public opinion, survey, and political methodology. One of the main questions that informs her research agenda is how election laws shape and mobilize the electorate. This theme figures prominently in her publications in academic journals such as Electoral Studies, Election Law Journal, Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, and American Politics Research. Her research has been featured in major news outlets such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. So we have a lot to cover tonight, and I'll turn it over to Nick to get the panel started so that we have plenty of time for audience questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks to everyone for participating in this terrific webinar. Let me just say what a delight it is to be here today. The University of Chicago is where I spent my first 7 years as a law professor. So it's an institution that is very near and dear to my heart. I think it's a place where academic inquiry is as rigorous as anywhere in the world. And that's reflected in that this event is happening and so many other terrific debates and discussions that take place under the banner of this institution. So thanks very much to Mark and to the university for putting together this event. So I wanted to start today by addressing what voting will be like in the upcoming American general election. Everyone is expecting that vote by mail in particular will skyrocket this year. And this is because many people are expected to choose to vote from the safety of their home without having to come into contact with other people at polling places where there's a risk of incurring the coronavirus. And so I thought we'd first talk about this vote by mail mode of voting and what we're likely to see in the upcoming election. Enrijeta, let me start with you. You've done some work on who is likely to vote by mail this year and on how people's interest in voting by mail varies by their partisan affiliation and by their support for President Trump. Can you tell us a bit about your findings on this subject?
Thank you, Nick. First, I want to thank University of Chicago, Hong Kong for organizing this event. It is a great pleasure to be part of this panel, and thank you to the audience for being with us today. Nick, going back to your question, I think that what we know about vote by mail to date, it is going to be enormously affected by COVID and this pandemic we are living in. We know from a previous research and my own previous research that people who used to vote by mail in the past were more likely to be, they looked like a likely voter. They were older, whiter, more interested in politics, and partisans. So they knew already who they were going to vote for, and they knew that they wanted to participate in the election. So up to 2018, we used to ask questions whether vote by mail, which is considered also a convenience vote method to allow people to vote, as you said, from the convenience of their home if they would not be able to vote in person on election day. All the questions that we used to ask were whether vote by mail actually increases turnout, whether it diversifies the electorate, and whether one of the major parties has an advantage driven by this vote method. However, in 2018, we heard the Georgia case during the general elections, and Georgia made made news, national news, for the high number of rejected mail ballots in the 2018 general election. My own research, that was the first time when we heard, okay, maybe this law was designed and to increase turnout, was designed to make voting easier for people. It is having some unintended consequences that we have not heard before. So that is what made me and my colleagues dive into the data and research and see who got affected. Who were the people that were more likely to have their ballots rejected in Georgia 2018 election? And we find that young 18 to 22-year-olds, minorities, and first-time registrants, they were the ones that were mostly affected by having their ballots rejected due to a signature issue, maybe a signature mismatch or missing signature on the vote by mail returning envelope, or because their ballots were received late by the election officials. However, we noticed that there was a variation in the rejection rates across Georgia counties, meaning that we might assume that there are some individual characteristics that might drive the rejection rates. Maybe these young voters who might be voting for the first time in their life ever, they were not familiar with the laws and rules that regulate vote by mail. But the variation across counties made us think that there might be also some structural design discrepancies and across counties, and we believe that there are differences in resources and discretion across these jurisdictions that verify ballots, or envelope design differences across counties. Because if the rejection rate would have been only on the voter part or on the individual characteristics, maybe we would expect to see a more unified, a uniform rejection rate. So given that we are living in the midst of a pandemic and vote by mail is the safest vote method to vote, to cast a ballot in these upcoming elections, health-wise, we would expect more people to vote by mail. Unfortunately, we might also expect the number of rejection rates to go up, but it is my hope that this conversation, it is going to drive people to look at the deadlines and get familiar with voting, with vote by mail laws in their county and in their state. And one concern that that what we hear these days is the postal service delays, which might make things worse in Georgia and those states that have not experienced an influx of vote by mail, which they are going to experience this time around. So that's what I would say.
Great, thank you, Enrijeta. Rick, let me turn to you. In the early days of the pandemic, many experts were communicating the following message to voters. Vote by mail. Don't risk your health by voting in person on election day. And we still hear that message with some frequency in the media. You're one of the leading critics of this position. Can you tell us what's wrong or what's misleading about this advice to all voters that where possible they opt to vote by mail?
Yes, and actually let me start off by saying that I want to echo your praise for the University of Chicago and the University of Chicago Law School in particular. I have taught there. I think it's a fantastic place to teach, and it's one of the great universities in the world. And I also want to mention that I grew up in Chicago, and even though I live in New York now and teach at NYU Law School, I'm willing to go on the record and say that I think Chicago is America's best city. And so for people who've only visited the coasts, I encourage you to see how gorgeous Chicago is, except in the winter. Now to talk about these voting issues, yes. So in the early days of the pandemic and our efforts to modify the primary elections that were going on in response to the emergence of the pandemic, there was a lot we didn't know, a lot of fears about what in-person voting might mean, and a push, which I agreed with, to give voters the option of voting by mail, which well over 85% of people in the United States will now have this fall. But we know there are various problems with the absentee ballot process. Professor Shino has just described some of them. We know that rejection rates of absentee ballots are significant. We are concerned about how the Postal Service will handle a massive volume across all these states of absentee ballots. We're concerned about the risk that if millions of ballots can't be counted until after election night, we could end up in a very explosive situation. And we've also learned a lot more about these health issues. So most public health people have now come out and said voting in person is going to be reasonably safe. Dr. Fauci has said this. Many other public health experts have said this and are trying to get this message across. Let's keep in mind what voting entails in terms of exposure to anybody. You're in a polling booth for 2 or 3 minutes. You're standing side by side, although you will be 6 feet apart as well. No one's talking to anybody. No one's facing directly, to anybody. And one of the things we've learned with the virus is that the risk of catching it and the severity, if you do catch it, is very much affected by how long you're exposed to an infected person. In fact, the public health people don't even do contact tracing of people who have been within 6 feet of an infected person unless they've been there for 15 minutes or more, which is not going to happen in the polling booth. So all of that is to say that it's very important, in my view, to get the message across now that voting in person is going to be safe as a health matter. There are lots of protocols in place. Lines at the polling places are going to be moved outdoors in many places. We have gotten much bigger venues for voting in person in many places. Of course, there will be disinfectants, screens will be wiped down regularly. All of these measures are going to be in place. Most people will be wearing masks just like they do to the grocery store. The polling places are going to provide masks for people who forget theirs. People who don't want to wear a mask will still be able to vote, but they'll be in the minority of people voting. And very importantly, many states have expanded the amount of days for early voting in this election, which is a form of voting in person, so that when I'm talking about voting in person, it doesn't mean everybody's showing up on election day. In fact, in some states, the early voting process has already begun. And so we can spread out early voting and not concentrate it all on one day. And in fact, my view, as you suggested, is that the best thing most voters can do to ensure a good election, a smooth election, an election that doesn't collapse into some of the worst case scenarios we worry about, is actually to vote in person, so that any of these issues connected to absentee ballots are minimized. Now, that's a very hard message to get across, particularly to Democrats and independents who have been, whose allies have been pushing for expanded absentee voting. And as I say, it's good that people have that option, but except for people who are in extremely high risk health categories, I think the higher percentage of people who vote in person in this election, the better for the process. And I have noticed that more messengers are kind of beginning to push this message. We have not yet seen the Biden campaign make this pivot. I everything is so politicized about our process now that the fact that President Trump has been urging in-person voting, I think makes it hard for the Biden campaign to turn around and push that message as well without seeming to endorse President Trump. But I want to reiterate that the higher the percentage of people who vote in person, the more we can minimize the problems Professor Shino talked about and other problems that concern me with absentee voting. We will certainly have higher rates of absentee voting than we've ever had, but there will be a big difference if 60% of the people vote absentee versus 35%. And that's the message I'm trying to convey now whenever I speak in these settings about the upcoming election.
Thank you, Rick. So Gowri, even if we'd all be better off following Rick's advice, so if fewer people voted by mail this year, it does seem clear, as Rick just said, that large numbers of people nevertheless will vote by mail. And of course, in that situation, there are better and worse ways for absentee voting or voting by mail to operate. Can you talk to us about what some of the best practices are for absentee voting? How can we make absentee voting as secure, as error-free as possible, given that it is going to occur in significant volumes this year?
Sure, and I want to say also thank you so much to Mark for inviting me to speak on this panel. I think it couldn't be a more important topic. It's why I took a leave from my job as a professor at Southwestern to work at the Brennan Center at NYU. And I'm really pleased to be speaking with all of you today. And I did also want to mention if folks have questions about getting their ballots back to the United States, voters who live outside the United States during the panel, I'd be happy to kind of answer questions about that as well. But getting back to your question, Nick, in terms of best practices, one of the best practices is unfortunately something that generally requires state legislatures in the United States to get on board with, which is to allow local election officials to begin processing mail ballots before election day. This allows election officials to get started on what is a pretty time-consuming process. And becomes even more time-consuming during a pandemic when staffers and election board members need to, be sitting 6 feet apart, be in larger warehouses so that they can protect themselves, because they're actually going to be in a space counting ballots for a long period of time, unlike voters, as Rick mentioned, who are hopefully only inside polling places for a few minutes. Doing all of that is time-consuming. It's harder during a pandemic. And so allowing local election officials to begin processing mail ballots before election day can really help them get a handle on the vote counting process and just not be under this sort of extreme time pressure from the media and other folks to do it really quickly. And part of why it takes a long time to count mail ballots is that all states have some sort of verification process when they receive a mail ballot to ensure that the person who sent back the ballot and filled it out is actually the voter who's entitled to vote. Many states use a signature verification process where they'll match a signature to a signature that they have on file for the voter. Many states will use ballot tracking that helps ensure that the envelope the voter sent back is actually the envelope that was sent to the voter. So that gives you a sort of added security check. And the best practice is for states to provide notice and cure opportunities, which you can't do unless you start providing those opportunities before election day for ballots that were received early. So what a notice and cure opportunity is when the voter is notified by email, text, mail, any avenue that's available to election officials, notified that there's something wrong with the envelope that they sent back. Maybe they didn't sign it properly, or you can't tell the signature, that sort of thing. It's important to give voters notice of that and then also give them an opportunity to fix that problem. So for instance, by submitting an affidavit with perhaps a less messy signature that can then be appropriately verified. And notice and cure opportunities are actually a security mechanism. They're not just access for the voter, because it helps you distinguish between what's usually the case which is a voter, you know, they broke their arm and their right hand is in a cast, and so that's why their signature is messy. Or they're a young person who hasn't done this before and didn't realize that their signature needs to match the signature that they used when they got their driver's license. You distinguish between that situation and what is an extremely rare situation, which is somebody has actually filled out a ballot and signed an envelope for somebody else and committed a crime. And so if you distinguish those situations, you can actually follow up and investigate in the concerning situations. But if you never provide notice and you never provide that opportunity for cure, you can't distinguish between the hundreds of thousands of cases that Enrijeta was speaking about that are, you know, innocent mistakes on the part of the voter, and any rare but extremely serious potential criminal cases. So those are some of the best practices. They take time to follow, and it's important for the public to be patient with election officials when they're going through all those verification processes. And it would be ideal, the time is running out, but it would be ideal for state legislatures to give election officials the legal authority to begin that process before election day so they can get a head start on it.
Thank you, Gowri. Let's turn next to some of the threats that we're facing for this year's election, and there are a number of different potential threats. Enrijeta, one of these threats is that there will be big partisan differences in the use of different modes of voting. For example, many more Democrats might vote by mail, despite the advice of Rick and others, and many more Republicans might vote in person. How much of a partisan differential do you expect to see this year between different modes of voting? And why does it matter if we do see these partisan discrepancies by mode of voting?
Thank you, Nick. As you said, or as Professor Pildes mentioned earlier, the vote by mail has been politicized so much lately, given the numerous criticisms that we hear, and also the cases of, because it has had high rejection rates in the last election. This summer, over the summer, my colleagues and I, we conducted a survey of Florida registered voters. And we wanted to ask them to get a better sense of Florida voters, who we know that Florida is a very important state in all elections, and to get their opinion on what they think about vote by mail, whether they have used it in the past, and whether they're going to use that vote method in the upcoming election. It was very interesting to see that how COVID actually, it is affecting voters' perceptions of vote by mail. We looked at those people, our respondents, who voted by mail in the last two elections, in the 2016 and 2018 elections. So in both those two elections, they voted by mail. And when we asked, have you voted by mail? People tend to misreport. And that misreporting of usage of vote by mail was higher among the Republicans compared to the Democrats. At the same time, Republicans were also they reported in a higher rate their intention to vote in person in this upcoming election, even though in the past two elections they have voted by mail. So this shows how much politicized this vote method has become. And one other important thing that I want to highlight is that all these differences between parties, between partisanship lines, actually they wash out when we control for support for the president. Everybody, our respondents who said that they intend to vote for President Trump this election, they were more likely to misreport having to vote by mail in the past, and misreport and say that they're going to vote in person. Now, you said, what are some of the problems we might see? If Democrats are going to vote only by mail and Republicans are going to vote in person, as we said already, Democrats might have might risk to have their ballots rejected at a higher rate. And that might affect the results, especially in Florida, where if we can think about in the 2018 election, the senatorial election here in the state, it was divided by only 10,000 votes. So if we expect a minimum of 10,000 votes to be rejected among Democrats, then that can be a decisive factor in who's going to win the state of Florida. Also, that's why I want to go back to Dr. Pildes' message that if people can vote in person, please do vote in person. It helps also election officials to run the election smoothly for the system and for us to have the election result on election night, but also to ensure that every ballot counts and every voice is going to be heard. Another problem that I think it is arising from this politicization of the vote method is that people might start losing trust in the system and in the electoral system. And I think that is dangerous, but I hope that people see all the efforts that are being done from the election officials and to make sure and to ensure that we are going to have a safe and secure and fair election this November.
Great, thank you, Enrijeta. Rick, let me turn to you. Another different threat is that there will be extensive litigation after the election, and courts will end up deciding critical issues, maybe even determining the winner of the election in certain states. If there is significant post-election litigation, what do you see as the most likely subjects of that litigation? And now we're really into the realm of speculation, but how do you see the Supreme Court thinking about those issues, especially if it has 6 conservative justices by then?
Well, we know this is already the most litigated election in our history. There are something like 300 lawsuits that have already been brought. Many of them have been resolved at this point. And in some ways, that's a reflection of the virus and the pressures it puts on the system, and then the debates about how the voting process should or shouldn't be modified to reflect the greater stresses the virus puts on the election system. And in many ways, that is a good thing, that there's an effort to get the rules settled in advance fairly clearly. Now we're getting very close to the election, and now it becomes more complicated to have courts involved. And one of the things to point out here, and Nick, your own work sort of confirms this, the reason we have so much litigation in the United States around these issues is partly because we do not have the kind of independent electoral commissions or independent sort of election bodies that oversee the process and resolve a lot of these issues, which many democracies have. And so in the absence of those kinds of institutions, people turn to the courts to sort of address issues that partisan legislatures are pursuing or not pursuing. I think the greatest source of potential litigation in this election is going to be over absentee ballots. And this is another reason I'm concerned that I'm trying to persuade more people to vote in person, because with an election that many people believe is a sort of existential, in the sense that if their side loses, the United States will never be the same country, with the stakes perceived as that high by so many people on both sides, and having come off an extremely close election in 2016, every inch of territory that a party or a campaign can grab through litigation, they're going to pursue, and they have been pursuing. And all of these issues about absentee ballots, were they properly confirmed as valid ballots? Were they properly rejected as invalid ballots? all of these open the opportunity for litigation. So it's not just going to be election officials who in the first instance are making these judgments, but you can bet the side that thinks it's losing out from that process is going to run to the courts. That will introduce more delay in the process. That could lead to, more prolonged uncertainty about the outcome. I think the US Supreme Court probably would like very much to have nothing to do with these issues, particularly after the election, if there are issues that arise after the election. Because the court understands that when it gets in the middle of something as partisan as choosing the chief executive, especially in our current political climate, that the side that loses before the court is inevitably going to view its decision as a partisan decision. I think that's entirely predictable. And I think the court understands that, and the court worries that that will compromise the legitimacy of the court and its role in all sorts of other matters that is so important for the country. That said, once issues get taken to court over the election, I can see why it's hard for the Supreme Court to be content with letting lower courts, state courts, lower federal courts have the final say on something as consequential as what the correct constitutional or legal rules are for resolving these disputes. So I think the court will be kind of torn. Now, we talk about all of these possible scenarios. I think it is also important to emphasize, these are low probability events. We need to talk about them to prepare ourselves to try to understand them in advance. But it would take a lot of very contingent matters to fall a certain way for us to ever end up at that point. The election would have to be incredibly close. There would have to be reasons to dispute certain parts of the process. Hopefully that won't happen. We don't want to be in that position. It's very rare to have an election as close as we had in 2016 or in 2000. And so the odds are against an election that close, but of course, who knows? We don't want to alienate voters from the process by suggesting it's going to be a chaotic mess and it's going to be fought over endlessly in the courts. That actually turns some people off from participating. And so it's a difficult message, difficult to strike the right balance in talking about possible concerns, possible involvement of the courts, possible Supreme Court involvement, without generating that kind of alienating sort of sense about the election as a whole.
Thank you, Rick. So Gowri, Rick just mentioned low probability events in this election. Some other low probability events include things like hacking by foreign powers, cyber attacks, orchestrated social media disinformation campaigns, maybe even the deployment of federal forces to polling places, civil unrest, etc. You've been involved in some wargaming that tries to simulate some of these scenarios. Can you tell us about these war games and what some of the main takeaways from them are?
Sure. I did want to, before I do that, I wanted to put a little asterisk on the advice that Rick has been giving to vote in person if you can. And that asterisk is if you have already requested an absentee ballot and have received that ballot, you are placing a great deal of stress on the system in many states by not using that ballot and instead going to the polls and voting in person. And the reason for that is that in a number of jurisdictions, if you have requested a mail ballot and then you show up in person at the polls to vote, there's extra processes that have to be undertaken in order to ensure that you don't vote twice, essentially, which is an extremely serious crime. So one process is that in some jurisdictions, they'll ask you to do what's called a provisional ballot, which means you fill out your ballot, but then it gets placed in an envelope, just like your mail ballot would have been. And you have to sign it, and then they wait until after all the mail ballots come in, check to make sure your mail ballot didn't come in. And once they've done that check, then they open up your envelope and count your provisional ballot. So that's a lot of steps, both on the counting end and in the polling place. That puts stress on the poll workers in the polling place to have you fill out those forms. And there actually are some reports that in some of the states that have already begun in-person early voting, that this is contributing to long lines in places like Fairfax County, Virginia, that we're seeing voters are afraid that their mail ballot isn't going to be received in time because they've heard these stories about postal delays. And so they're just coming in person to vote, you know, just to be sure that their vote will count. So what I would say is definitely if you have requested a mail ballot and you have received it, and you have plenty of time, which you do if that's now, you definitely have plenty of time to return it. It's probably better to read the instructions really carefully, call your local election official if you have any questions about it. If you have physical dexterity issues, get assistance from someone that you trust, which is permitted. If you have disabilities and reasons like that to need assistance, do all of that, and then either mail the ballot back extremely early so that there's plenty of time for it to be received, or use a secure drop box, which is available in a lot of jurisdictions. It's like a metal box that's like anchored to the ground, and you stick your ballot in there, the election officials pick it up right from there. Or in a lot of jurisdictions, and you can check with your local election official on this, in a lot of jurisdictions, you can go to an early vote site and drop off your mail ballot. And you could even ask the person who accepts it for you, like, looks like everything's okay, right? And they can kind of do an eyeball check. It's not a formal verification, but they could, you know, say, no, actually you forgot to sign it, or no, you needed to get a witness to fill out this section. So that's what I would say, especially because there are a lot of jurisdictions where you might have to vote provisionally if you do that. Okay, that answer, that being said, I want to return to your actual question, Nick, which is these war games. So yeah, so it's something called a tabletop exercise. It's used in a lot of different industries. Universities even use them to plan for, you know, mass shooter events and things like that and get prepared. What it is the officials who would be in charge of any emergency response get together. Nowadays it's virtually over Zoom, but it used to be in person, and that's why it's called tabletop exercise, and sit at a table. And then the person teaching the exercise or administering the exercise will just throw up different, you know, scenarios, like, you know, there's someone trying to block voters from getting into the polling place, or this completely incorrect information about where to vote is suddenly going viral on social media. And then the officials in the room sort of practice just talking through what they would do. Okay, who do I contact? Do I have the phone number of this law enforcement official? Who's my contact at the Department of Homeland Security who can help me with this? Those sorts of things. And so the Brennan Center, in partnership with CISA, which is a subdivision of the Department of Homeland Security, we've conducted tabletop exercises, and also in partnership with Microsoft, I should say, both in person before the pandemic hit and virtually, that local election officials participated in. And a lot of other organizations in the United States have been conducting these exercises with election officials as well. More commonly with state level election officials, I'd say. I've participated in the ones I've done are a little bit unique because we're focusing on local election officials. And I think one thing voters should know is that it's great that election officials are doing this, practicing, planning, so that you know, people aren't going to panic if these low probability events actually occur. They're going to you know, follow their playbook and do what needs to be done to ensure that they can recover from those attacks, particularly cyber attacks, and that importantly, and that's the focus of the exercises the Brennan Center runs, so that importantly voters can keep voting even if that happens, right? So let's say there's a cyber attack on what's called electronic poll books, which are devices that a lot of locations use to check in voters, check that they're eligible to vote, sign, you know, check them off when they've voted so that they don't come back and vote again, that sort of thing, although that's extremely rare. Those books, if they get attacked, it would be impossible to sort of process voters in that way. And so one of the backup plans that a lot of election officials have put in place is to have a paper backup list of the eligible voters in the jurisdiction and switch to that. So election officials practice saying, okay, I would call up, what's my line of communication to all the polling places to let them know, like, you need to switch to the paper backup so that voters can keep voting, and they're not just, standing outside in line for hours and hours. So yeah, election officials are being careful. They're planning, for a lot of these low probability events, and as we're getting closer, hopefully they're feeling ready. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Gowri. So this is an important election for many reasons. One that doesn't get as much attention is that it's a critical election for redistricting. After this election, new district lines will be drawn for legislatures at every level of government in America, from Congress all the way down to school boards. So in many areas of the country, who wins this election will determine who gets to draw the lines that will then shape the next decade of American politics. Rick, let me turn back to you. You've written about just about every aspect of redistricting. Can you give us a preview of what you expect to see in the upcoming cycle, both with respect to partisanship, partisan gerrymandering, and with respect to race-related issues, especially under the Voting Rights Act?
Yes, so one of the interesting things about the redistricting that's going to take place after the census and after the new state legislatures and governors are elected is that Democrats are probably going to have significantly more power than they did in the 2010 round of redistricting. That's already true from the elections that have taken place since then. The 2010 round of redistricting was the first one actually in the modern era in which Republicans had the dominant sort of power across state legislatures. They were in control of the process in many more states than Democrats were. And Democrats throughout the decade have been complaining about some of these aggressive partisan gerrymanders. And as you know, I have litigated against some of them, including up to the Supreme Court. But one of the things I'm watching for now is if Democrats get more control, will they actually be willing to make the change that I think is the only change that will make a significant difference for this issue, which is to take this power to draw these lines out of the hands of elected legislatures and create various forms of independent commissions to design election districts. I am concerned about whether Democrats, having complained for a decade about partisan gerrymandering, are actually going to give up that power when they're in charge in states that they may be in charge of after 2020. We are the only country in the world that has election districts, the only democracy that has election districts that puts the power to draw those districts entirely in the hand of the most self-interested actors, the sitting state legislatures, which unsurprisingly will use that power frequently to try to entrench themselves in office, to promote their partisan allies, in Congress, for example, when they draw congressional districts. I think that's inherently a defect in the design of democratic processes. And I think that voters have become much more concerned about this issue. Many of us have been talking about it for 25 or 30 years, but in the last just even 5 or 6 years, we've seen a significant change where states that have direct democracy processes have actually adopted through voter-initiated measures in 4 or 5 states in the last election, shifts towards independent commissions. And so voters have become more disgusted by this process. And apart from the issue of, how will the lines get drawn and are we going to have any constraints on partisan manipulation, I think it's going to be an interesting test for Democrats about whether they will relinquish this power when they have it and push for independent commissions. I certainly hope they'll do that. This is an endless source of litigation in the US, as you know, both on the partisan gerrymandering front and on the role of race in the redistricting process. It's not a good thing to have these districts constantly subject to challenge and overturning in courts. I mean, we need a fair process for drawing them in the first place. And that's really what we should be pushing for. And I think I do see more movement in that direction. And I hope after 2020, that movement has a lot of steam, both with voters and with state legislatures.
Great, thanks, Rick. Gowri, let me turn back to you. You've written a couple of papers on the really promising technique of randomized redistricting. So using a computer algorithm to churn out very large numbers of district maps. Can you tell us what are some ways in which this technique could be deployed in the years ahead? Is it useful only in litigation? Could it be used to actually design the districts that will be used as well? Like, what are some of the potential applications of this technique?
Sure. I actually think that one of the best applications of this technique is use by an independent redistricting commission of the sort that Rick is talking about. So what this technique is it's essentially, there's a number of different techniques, but a number of mathematicians and computer scientists have come up with ways to generate extremely large numbers of possible different options for redistricting maps. And some of those techniques actually generate what we hope is a pretty representative set of those maps. And by representative, I mean representative of the maps that a neutral, not selfish, not partisan person would come up with. So some people are interested in using those in litigation to say, hey, the map you, state legislature, came up with is really an outlier compared to this set of maps that a neutral person would have come up with. So, aha, I've proven it. You probably were being very partisan or selfish when you created your map. But I think an independent redistricting commission could use these to check their work, essentially, ensure that they haven't been unfair substantively to particular people with particular political affiliations, to racial groups, that sort of thing. I also think that courts enforcing the Voting Rights Act could use this technique to find maps that create opportunity districts for minority voters without having to rely on sort of very political entities who bring this litigation and fight this litigation to sort of come up with possible maps and possible options. Courts, they could, appoint a special master, that kind of person, to use this technique. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of different ways to use it that I think are even more promising than just using it to prove that someone, was being self-interested. I personally don't think it should take so much to prove that someone whose goal is to get reelected and that sort of thing is self-interested. I think it's better to use these maps for sort of proactively trying to improve the system and make it more fair.
Great, thanks, Gowri. So we're heading toward the end of our hour. So I wanted to shift gears now from my questions to some of the questions that have come in from members of the audience. And I won't direct these questions to a particular panelist. I'll just invite whichever panelist has relevant thoughts to contribute those comments. So one question relates to the issue of foreign interference with the election. Of course, this was a very big deal in 2016 with Russian interference in the election. And there are already reports that similar efforts by foreign powers, including but not only limited to Russia, are going on in this election too. So how big of an issue do the panelists think this is? Should we be alarmed? Should we be hair on fire? Or relatively unconcerned about the prospect of foreign interference with our electoral process?
I'm happy to start the conversation there. I think I would distinguish between two different kinds of foreign manipulation potentially. So, of course, if there is a risk of foreign entities actually penetrating voter registration databases, for example, that would be an absolutely enormous concern. Now, the cybersecurity people say the states are in much better position on that now than before. I'm no expert on that, but of course that would be an enormous issue. When it comes to the second kind of foreign interference we talk about, like the ones that the Russians engaged in 2016, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, disinformation, misinformation, I actually think we are going to have so much disinformation, manipulation, misinformation from domestic actors in the United States that I suspect that will actually even overwhelm whatever foreign disinformation efforts might be out there. You know, this is the dystopian side of social media. You know, after our initial kind of romantic enthusiasm about how much this was going to empower citizens and democracies, we've obviously become much more wise about the various purposes to which social media can be very effective in very negative ways. And so I think it's almost, it's really the disinformation that's going to happen internally that, to me, on that issue is an even bigger concern. Of course, we don't want foreign manipulation, but I suspect it's going to be small potatoes compared to what we see domestically.
Any other thoughts by the panelists?
Yeah, I'll jump in on the first issue. I agree with Rick's sort of delineation of two different types of interference. And so the first type that he identified, like a cyber attack on the voter registration database, I think it's something to take seriously. We know from the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation and from Special Counsel Mueller's, some of his indictments, that foreign entities did in fact attempt to infiltrate voter registration databases in the United States in the run-up to the 2016 election. And they were successful in some cases. They did not actually alter the records in the cases that have been publicly revealed, but they did successfully get in to the Illinois state's registration database, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, and actually exfiltrated is the word they used, some of the data, so they were able to export some of it. I actually think there may have just been regular cyber criminal intent behind that, because that data might be used for financial crimes and that sort of thing. There's personal information of voters in registration databases. So it is something to be concerned about, but it's also true that states now have much better connections with the Department of Homeland Security. Many of them are taking the issue seriously. They've done a lot to beef up those systems, backing up their databases on offline servers so that they have something to go back to if they get attacked. But it actually brings me to something that states could still do in the few weeks that are left before November 3rd, which is one of the things we're advocating for at the Brennan Center. And that the states can build in really simple paper resiliency plans to protect the vote. So for instance, they can print out a whole bunch of those provisional envelopes. I talked about provisional voting before, so that if the registration database is hacked and suddenly, maybe during the last few days of early voting or on election day, it appears that you just can't figure out who's eligible to vote and who's not. It's going to take you a few days to recover your database. You can at least let voters vote provisionally so that you can keep those lines moving and get voters processed. And then once you resolve the issue later, you can go through those provisional votes and figure out which ones count, which ones don't. Probably most of them would count, right? Because most people don't attempt to vote if they're not eligible to vote. So there are simple things like literally print a whole bunch of provisional envelopes and supply them to the polls just in case. That can still be done before election day. So I would say it's not something to have your hair on fire about, but it is something to take seriously, and it's worth, it's worth the cost of, some extra envelopes is our position to try to make sure that if, it's not what we want, but if something like that happens, then people are not disenfranchised.
Right. And Gowri, you mentioned the resiliency of certain American election systems, which actually brings us to what I think would be a nice final question for this event. How resilient do the panelists think that American democracy is in the face of all of these challenges? And how are other democracies around the world supposed to keep faith when they see the world's oldest, most respected democracy under attack in so many different ways?
And that's a huge question. So let me just, I guess, offer a couple of thoughts about it. There is no question that American democracy faces stresses now unlike any in my lifetime. The level of distrust in our institutions, which extends to the election process, is enormous. Polls show that about 25% of both Biden and Trump supporters today say that if their candidate loses, it can only be because the election is rigged or was rigged. People are primed to suspect the worst. Again, social media will accelerate, throw tremendous fuel on any kind of minor problems or innocent problems that might arise. And disputed elections for the top executive figure in the country are moments of great stress on democracies. And in our current climate, I am definitely concerned. I think you're absolutely right. Countries around the world are looking at the United States now and the democratic process and the election system, and they're shocked at some of what they see and concerned. Some of this is overhyped because partisans have a tremendous advantage in trying to convince their supporters that the process is rigged. It's a way of mobilizing people, and that's being played up tremendously. So I am concerned. Now, I think we will probably have a smooth election and a relatively clear process at the end of the day. But the forces that are in place to really destabilize the legitimacy of the outcome are very powerful right now. And that's why it's important that we do everything we can to minimize any potential problems that arise with the process. So there is reason for concern, but there's also reason to think the election officials are going to run a good process after all the effort they put into updating the process in light of the virus.
Great, thank you, Rick.
I'm sorry to everybody that I have to get to my other event. I apologize, but this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for including me. Take care.
Thank you, Rick. We have a couple of minutes if some of the other panelists want to jump in as well before we bring this.
About that question, if I think that the American democracy is being put on a test now, I think it is, but I really am strongly convinced that it is going to resist this test that it is being put on. The only thing why I think it is being put on a test, it is due to the misinformation that we hear in the social media and also the high polarization that we are seeing in the electorate and among the people. So they might leave some people after the election to think that if they're not happy with the election result, that the elections were rigged or foreign powers meddled with our democracy. But I think that American institutions, they are strong and they are stronger than what many of us might think. And they are going to endure this test that they are put into this election.
Great, thanks, Enrijeta. Gowri, anything to add?
Not too much. I think one thing I would say is that, yeah, definitely, it's completely understandable that people are concerned, and I agree that misinformation is a huge factor in democracy being put to this test. One thing that's a bit unique about American elections, and that I think is hopefully going to help, is that they're extremely decentralized. So you've heard me over and over during this panel talking about local election officials, state election officials. So states and actually counties and municipalities in the US have the primary authority to actually just administer these elections, to verify absentee ballots, verify provisional ballots, all of those things. And that decentralization does actually help, because it means any truly effective attack on, one piece of the process has a pretty low probability of actually changing the outcome of something like who gets elected president, right? I do think there is some resiliency in terms of that form of interference that's really baked into the system. It makes things complicated and it makes it hard to reform elections in the United States, but it also makes it kind of strong and resilient, which I think people should take some comfort in.
Great, thank you very much, Gowri, and a big thank you to all of our panelists and to Mark and to the University of Chicago for putting on this wonderful event. I hope you all who are in attendance also participate in the other terrific webinars in this series. With that, we can say stay safe to everybody. And for those of you who are eligible to vote in the upcoming American election, please make sure to exercise the franchise and cast a timely vote in a way that's going to be counted and without incurring any health risks either. So with that, we'll bring this event to a close, and thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.